Welcome to Politics at Sam and the debrief. What a day, which went from this.
As we understand it, Angela Rayner has resigned from government as Deputy Prime Minister and Housing Minister.
To this.
We are all ships rising on a turquoise tide, headed ever closer towards winning the next general election.
To this.
I should say as well that Downing Street sources are also telling us that David Lammy, who's just, of course, been moved to Justice Secretary from Foreign Secretary, will also be the Deputy Prime Minister.
My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElvoy from Politico. Welcome to the first conference season debrief edition, where we promise to wrap up what just happened at the big political clan gatherings in double quick time. And today was dominated by double high drama in the government and in its challengers. Nigel Farage convened his Reform UK for fire and fury in Birmingham. And on the other side of a remarkable split screen, Angela Rayner resigned all of her political roles, and Keir Starmer has been busy ever since, turning his cabinet upside down.
That's right. We convened to tell you about Nigel Farage, but it's good that we're here because we'll just talk about everything. This, to me, Anne, feels like a reset in government where they are basically completely starting again. Now, for everyone listening to this podcast, they tend to be pretty time poor. So we're going to give you everything we think you need to know about the events of today ahead of the weekend. And so we're going to start with the reshuffle because that is the biggest thing. Who is in, who is out, and what happened with Angela Rayner, because it was all kicked off after she was judged to be in breach of the ministerial code for avoiding paying full stamp duty on her new home in Hove.
And the conclusion by the ethics investigator, Sir Laurie Magnus, was that she had ignored warnings about her tax bill and the advice that she should have sought. 48 hours after telling Sky that she'd been following the advice of her lawyer all along, the official investigator found that wasn't the whole story. In two instances, the legal advice was heavily qualified. She was told it didn't constitute expert tax advice, and it was accompanied by a suggestion, and in one case, even a recommendation that specific tax advice be found. Now, that was not a survivable conclusion. And hours later, despite Keir Starmer's support earlier this week, she was gone. What did you make of that segue, Sam?
One of the reasons that people found Angela Rayner such an attractive politician was because she was visibly a risk taker. But of course, risks are risks, and she took one too many, I think, in all of this and was caught out by the media. So there are a lot of people who talk about sympathy and circumstance. I'm going to sort of sidestep that way of analysing what happened. Ultimately, she took a chance. She took a chance on not checking whether or not she should pay the proper tax that she is obliged to pay under the law. And then took a chance a second time by running on telly and claiming that somebody else was to blame for that advice being wrong. And in both cases, that wasn't quite right. She wasn't following the letter of what she was relaying and acting on the letter of what she was being told. And she was only caught out because of media scrutiny. If the Telegraph hadn't run those stories, I'm not sure we would be where we are today. So I suppose if you put it like that, it's hard to have a great deal of sympathy given Keir Starmer's stipulations on coming into government about the importance of following rules and the importance of being judged against them when there are claims. And I know that there are lots of nuances around the tax advice being complicated and her family circumstances being difficult. But as we were saying on Thursday morning, I really struggle because when somebody is in government, their job is to take expert advice and then decide using their political nous whether or not to act on it. And she was presented with a piece of advice which was to pay the lower amount of tax, and there was a risk that she chose to oversee. And I think then we are in very difficult territory, and I think it was always going to go like this. I think it has been difficult. And I think it has been painful in government, not least because they clung on to her without double-checking the facts early enough before giving definitive denials about about the allegations in the papers, only to have to backtrack. So the whole thing has proved to be a very messy affair.
Indeed. And I think as we reflected on the podcast on Thursday, which now seems like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? There was one way through it, which was that Laurie Magnus would say, look, any reasonable person would have done what you did and would understand why you acted as you did. But he didn't say that. He said very courteously, he was very, in some ways, quite praising of Angela Rayner's public service. I think he wanted to take the edge off the sword, but he was applying the sword. And he said there was not an excuse for not failing to seek more sophisticated advice, given her prominent role, which I think, Sam, that topples a sort of domino effect of the argument, oh, you're just getting at Angela Rayner because she's a working class girl who's done good, because actually she had done very good and she'd ended up very close to the top of British government. So therefore, I think once we read those words, we knew that her career for now was over. But for me, the story is moving very fast, has moved fast today, away from one of those unfortunate industrial accidents that befall politicians from time to time when they make a personal error and they can't survive the fallout. The problem for me now seems to be, and you see it in the reshuffle, which we'll come on to in a second, is that the entire government operation has been thrown into chaos by this. And Keir Starmer, this was getting very close to Keir Starmer's judgment for a reason that you just alluded to. They did seem, the number 10 machine, and ultimately the Prime Minister, to kind of want to believe Angela Rayner without checking. And that also makes them look a bit negligent. So you can see it a little bit in the rather defensive communications and the gaps in testing her claims have now become full-on crisis management and pushed Keir Starmer into reshuffle, which is being called a renewal reshuffle. A renewal reshuffle. It does not trip off the tongue, as you've just heard from me. And I think that sort of tells you something about the haste. Shall we run through who's in and out then? And we promise we're going to do this as fast as we can to get to the analysis. Here goes. So we have David Lammy out of the Foreign Office, despite being promised he would have that job. That was long-standing promise that Keir Starmer made. Not in it for so long as it turned out, but he will be Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary. I thought as he walked up to number 10, he looked pretty chipper, so maybe he doesn't mind that switch too much. Who else?
Having sorted out the prison system and handed that over to David Lammy, Shabana Mahmood will now move from Justice to the Home Office, where there's been a clear out after a brutal summer. Yvette Cooper and her team thought to be completely on the way out. Huge amounts of policy work has gone on there, but where does it leave everything?
Yvette Cooper gets a plum job at Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Lots of experience, at least negotiating with the French. Her job will now go a lot broader, means the whole issue of Gaza and Israel lands with her.
Peter Kyle is the new business secretary, so that means trade and tariffs is his bailiwick.
Steve Reid to the Housing Department, 1.5 million new homes to deliver somehow is his problem now, and he ran the 2021 anti-development campaign against Tory housing expansion.
Pat McFadden to work and pensions. And there's been a bit of a tweak to that department. They've taken over the skills portfolio from education. And I have to say, that makes it sound to me like that they could, in pretty quick order, be trying again on welfare reform.
100%. Liz Kendall to the Science and Technology Department. She gets to handle all those tricky AI decisions, which have ended up mired in the long grass.
A new face in Cabinet, Emma Reynolds, a retread MP. In other words, she returned to Parliament at the last election. She was in the Treasury. She jumped into Cabinet in the position of DEFRA, so the Environment and Rural Affairs, and that requires her to deal with the farmers. She proves the lesson that if you can survive at LBC Nick Ferrari mauling, you can survive in political life.
Douglas Alexander becomes Scottish Secretary, so he leaves international trade behind and comes home to a job that he has, in fact, done before, Sam. I think it was back in 2006 onwards.
That's right. Johnny Reynolds becomes the chief whip. He's leaving the business department to take over the job of handling Labour MPs, who are a bit raucous and, fractious at the moment. I think he'll be a bit disappointed with that. And he takes over from Alan Campbell, who was the chief whip, but now becomes the Commons leader. So out of government, just three names. Lucy Powell, leader of the Commons, who made those remarks about immigration that went down very badly a few weeks ago. Ian Murray, who leaves as Scottish Secretary, and I read briefings that Keir Starmer just really didn't like him, and of course Angela Rayner. And looking at this reshuffle overall, what do you make of it?
Well, no doubt this was a shock response. A couple of things stand out for me. This is in the main a reshuffle of people who've gained Starmer's trust. There aren't any, I can see, fast risers nabbing top jobs over the heads of the tried and tested figures. So it's not a social mobility reshuffle. And it's not something that you could do, I suspect, in a heartbeat. So I think it does tell us that the Prime Minister had spent some time over summer thinking about how he wanted to firm up the contours of his government. He certainly wouldn't have been intending to do it in this shotgun way. But I think some of this does look like it was worked out in a bit of a Rubik's Cube, and not only in a couple of hours of total panic in number 10, though there was probably a bit of that as well. I think we're seeing people promoted who are not squeamish on matters like immigration and asylum, absolutely the A game of Nigel Farage and Reform and Labour's challengers. So Shabana Mahmood and Pat McFadden, I think, would be good examples there of a more kind of flinty style of person who's coming to the forefront of the cabinet. Forthright on the need for changes to asylum rules in Shabana Mahmood's case. McFadden, I think clearly, and you put your finger on it quickly, with a view to putting that welfare reform that derailed the government before the summer back on track. There were rumours that there was a desire to move David Lammy out of the Foreign Office and to have someone there replacing Angela Rayner, who can also cite the fact, justifiably, he's overcome challenges as a Black Briton to reassure his party that it hasn't lost that sensibility for supporting those getting to the top of politics that wouldn't happen so readily, they would say, sometimes in other parties, or at least not in the same way. I can't help thinking, here's a naughty thought for you, Sam, because you love Treasury intrigue, that Pat McFadden to the Department of Work and Pensions prepares a track for him to number 11 if Starmer ever feels the time is right to look for a Rachel Reeves replacement. But what did you pick up on?
On Pat McFadden, I wonder, that depends how he performs in public, I think, in the job of Work and Pension Secretary. He's a great backroom operator. I'm surprised that Keir Starmer has decided to not want to keep him at his side so closely. He was always said to be in the engine room of this government. Well, not as of this afternoon, but the question mark around him has always been whether or not he can bring people with him in a kind of collegiate and political way. Look, that's just one bit of a reset that gives me the sense that they're really starting again everywhere apart from the Treasury. And before the reshuffle started, we were told that anything could change apart from Rachel Reeves. And of course, what's going on in the Treasury and the 20 to 40 billion pound black hole arguably is the most contentious bit of this government. So maybe they're changing everything else but the difficult bit. But look, that leads me to this thought. If the allegation levelled towards this government is that they weren't really prepared for power, well, there are just 23 days until Labour conference for the new cabinet to get to grips with their new briefs and write their speeches. They're going to be getting up to pace at speed. They've inherited 3-year spending plans that they didn't negotiate. And this isn't a great big influx of new talent. There are only 3 departures, and otherwise everything is switching around. So it's the same faces and the same problems, but just to move around. I think it's going to mean that there's a lot of people starting from scratch. And that also means that the status of just about every policy area all of a sudden is up in the air. For me, if I wanted to pick out one move that stuck out, Yvette Cooper had done all the heavy lifting for this government for migration. She'd negotiated the deal with the French. A lot is riding on that. She'd spent all summer and her ministers working in the Home Office. She was the public face of this government. A huge amount of eggs were in the Home Office basket, and she'd been doing Home Affairs for years in the Select Committee before she joined as Shadow Home Secretary, and she's just out like that to the Foreign Office. My question is this: did Keir Starmer keep her in place and not really trust her, or is he disowning the policy? Is he actually saying the treaty with France, the one in, one out deal, and the plan with the French to disrupt the boats as they come over, that they aren't his policy? Is it she that was being a problem, and if so, why? And if not, and he wants to change the policy, what is the policy? That's the kind of danger of the signal that things like this are set. Clearly, Some personnel moves do signal, I think, a change on policy. I think that's true on welfare, as you were saying. Pat McFadden, I think, will begin to use skills brief attached to DWP to try and make an argument that we can get people back into work by using skills. Shabana Mahmood gave the game away last weekend where she said we need to get some money out of welfare. Expect that to happen pretty quickly. That's a battle for very soon. So I think it's a huge reset, but still I'm left wondering why, and I'm still left wondering whether the cabinet ministers who are now just getting their new red boxes are going to be prepared anytime soon.
Well, let me just try to respond by channeling a bit of Keir Starmer. This is something he would never say, so I'm basically making up my inner Keir Starmer here. I think what was going on, and we started to talk about it a bit on the podcast, looking at the rise and rise of Shabana Mahmood. She's very well seen in the right of centre press, for instance, in a way that Yvette Cooper sort of still comes across as being someone who rose initially through the Gordon Brown machine. She was certainly always in the centre of Labour, but did she ever really sound, let's say, listen to the tone that we're going to talk about in a second, Nigel Farage reform, public anger about the asylum system, about the asylum hotels. Yvette Cooper went at it, as she would see it, very sensibly and rigorously and managerially. But did she have a tone that put across on behalf of the government, we absolutely understand how furious a lot of people are about this and why they think it has such salience, when in the great scheme of things, you could say, yes, it's a lot of money, but, it's can be very disruptive in certain communities. But, do we really need to play it up so much? I mean, this was really a view that you heard a lot around the elite end of Labour. And I think Shabana Mahmood is, the word flinty springs to mind. I think they want people who don't sound like they're squeamish about being accused of moving to the right under Keir Starmer. So I think that would be my explanation if it is one. And I would just quickly say on Pat McFadden, once Darren Jones came into number 10, who seems to be king of all surveys and able to tell ministers what they can do and not do, I wonder whether that might be one too many. And it's funny, isn't it, that Darren Jones seemed like the most exciting news that we had a few days ago. And now look.
Right, let's have a listen to exactly that kind of language that the new team are up against. Because the big event of the day, what was meant to be the big event of the day, has been 115 miles north of Westminster. It's lucky we all stayed behind in some senses, but the big event was meant to be at the Birmingham NEC, where Nigel Farage was giving his first speech as leader. Now, as a helpful reminder of the real pecking order in British politics, he was the one that had to change his plans. He brought his speech forward from 4 p.m. to 1 p.m. To avoid it clashing with the reshuffle. Now, the point of the speech, aides told me, was to be a celebration of reform's achievements. And he did strike an upbeat tone. Let's listen to a bit.
I stood before you this time last year. At this very conference, we only had a handful of branches around the country. We now have 450 branches. We had 30,000 paid-up members. In the last hour, we've gone through 240,000 members. As I toured round the country on May the 2nd, I frankly myself couldn't believe just how well we'd done. Couldn't believe the extent to which we'd caught the mood.
So, Anne, we both listened. What did you make of this address? We'll go into a couple of the big themes again in a moment. But what's your opening impression?
2027. One date. That's what we were intended to take away, which, if one looks at political communication, just one thing you can remember, you have to say that's pretty smart, right? Because we're going to start talking about that. There was every chance, Nigel Farage said, of a general election happening. In fact, he seemed to go at one point into kind of prophet mode. Like, he could see the future, and in 2027 it would be not another one territory. We would be back to elections. Now, whether or not that's realistic, what he was doing was getting away, I think, from reform, living from one election to the next, obviously on a timeline decided by whoever's in power, by, as he would see it, the orthodox party's business as usual. And essentially, he was saying 150-seat majority could crumble, therefore that the government was in a perpetual crisis from now onwards. Of course, there's a huge amount of wishful thinking there, but the timing, you have to say, was propitious for Nigel Farage. And if you wanted to make the case that reform had been sat for too long at the children's table of UK politics, patronised by the other parties, a bit by a lot of the media. Well, you would look at the chaos of Labour today, the Tories struggling so badly in the polls, and say, well, if that's the grown-ups, I mean, bring on the kids on their scooters. Just a little detail that I noticed from our PM playbook, which was the entertainment politics in Birmingham, where we had our minds on what was going on with the government. You know, we had Andrea Jenkins. She came on a bit like whipping up the crowd. The broadcaster Jeremy Kyle, never knowingly understated, pounding around with a microphone, chatting to Reform fans in the crowd, and also doing a bit of a comedian turn. So what we think when we do clips, and we hear a lot of clips as we'll do here on the podcast, is there was a real kind of Barnum mood there. It wasn't, some people say he runs things a bit like rallies that maybe for some people have a slightly unfortunate undertone. But this was also a defense of the flag, fly the flag, take the argument about the flag to Keir Starmer. It was a real, almost like a fairground mood in which he was moving then between sort of comedy and then saying, but really, this is the serious business. We're all here to have a good time, but this is now a real party conference with a view to getting into power.
Yeah, I mean, on the sort of optics of it, Reform are very, very good, better than the other parties at the razzmatazz, at the visuals. They're spectacular. I don't know why Labour and Tory can't get their ducks in a row. They make it look like there's momentum, there's crowds, there's fireworks. It's the full works. It looks like a game show from the 1980s, and Nigel Farage, the host, walking down the stairs. But what I actually thought of the speech in total was that it was not a particularly polished effort. Um, Nigel Farage did it off the top of his head. He'd only landed back from America yesterday. There was no auto cue. I'm told he'd never rehearsed in the hall. And I'm not sure it gelled. Nigel Farage is very good at press conferences. And what we got was a series of extended press conference question answers and not a sort of coherent argument. And bizarrely, halfway through the speech, was crowbarred in an awful lot of Nadine Dorries, who was invited on stage and then spoke at incredible length, which frankly disrupted the coherence of all that was going on. So overall, I slightly thought it was a bit rambly. The sub-editor in me would want to cut it down. He was extemporising. It was a lunch speech, not a conference speech. Other leaders spend months working out themes, notes to hit, and language. That wasn't what they do. It's not what they do. It was a feel-good affair for the people in the room. And there were two big arguments. So let's just move on to analysing those. His first big argument was that Britain is broken.
Our country is in a very bad place. It's a mixture between anger and despair. Is it any wonder that the protests have sprung up outside the hotels? We are in economic decline. We are in societal breakdown with law and order. We are in cultural decline. It's as if our leaders have forgotten who we were. Our country is without doubt in the most dangerous place it's been in my lifetime.
That has been, and the core argument of Reform UK all this summer. It's its most polished material, but it's also, don't you think, a little bit par for the course? We've heard it all before. This is what we expect. Was there anything new in the sort of kind of diagnosis of the condition?
Well, you make a good point that one shouldn't sort of drink the Kool-Aid just because something felt quite energetic in the way, the dynamism of Reform's convening power. It can make one sort of sometimes forget that there are other bits that are very, very kind of rough shod. But I wonder whether you were having a sort of analysis of his failure to write a classic political symphony when what he was doing was a kind of rough and ready improv jazz. He's kind of riffing. And that's what Nigel Farage does. Maybe his style is never going to be what you lay out. He's not going to move smoothly from one idea to another. He kind of bounces between things. But there is a sign that at some level, they do know that, or he does know that, and that is this idea of a policy role, a head of policy role for Zia Yusuf. Now that, once you get to the internal politics of Reform, which were being played out very strongly around this conference, Richard Tice was out there preaching a kind of more fiscal orthodoxy in some ways. Well, let's wait and see if we can do those big tax cuts we promised you. We have a lot of problems to sort out first. It's like, hello, it sounds like something Conservative Central Office would have been saying, and he is thought to be closer to the more fiscally Conservative Party kind of rhetoric, and others obviously, are more heated or more reckless, depending on your view of what they're promising. I think that we're in for an interesting time when Zia Youssef tries to pull together all of these policy areas, which Nigel Farage, to your point about him sort of jumping about, he conceded that they would need to do that to be ready for government for this putative election in 2027. But either way, whenever the election is. So there was, I think, an acknowledgement that this was to rally the troops, make the most of a terrible day for the government, bring on Nadine Dorries. A lot of people who are close to Boris Johnson seem to be getting closer and closer to reform or in it. And that maybe the rest could be worked out later. Well, when the rest starts to get worked out, I think there'll be fireworks.
I've got a question for you, Anne. I'm going to play you one last bit of Nigel Farage. And as you're listening to it, I want you to ask, how does this differ really from what Kemi Badenoch will say in a couple of weeks? So this is the bit where he talks about what Reform UK would do in government.
Let's make Britain great again. I've heard that phrase somewhere else before. And we will. We will make Britain safer again, beginning with zero tolerance policing. We will bring back genuine stop and search on our streets to drive out knives. We will deport foreign criminals, and we will detain and deport those who illegally break into our country. We will stop the boats within 2 weeks of winning government.
Now, I'm not saying that sounding quite similar to the Tories is necessarily bad for reform. It may well be that it's bad for the Tories and Kemi Badenoch in the end, depending on who wins the tussle between those two parties over the next couple of years. But there's not a great deal of difference between them, is there?
Do you think that's not deliberate, though? Because if Nigel Farage had continued, there was quite a lot of Trump adoration and MAGA speak in there for people who like that kind of things. They really want everything torn up. They want to blow the bloody doors off, to cite the great old line in The Italian Job. They don't just want to rebuild the house of British politics. They want to knock it down first. But then there's another target group for him, which is disaffected Conservatives who are not like that. They're temperamentally not like that, but they've sort of had enough. People sitting around and talking to you from Kent now, keep encountering it again and again. It's not people who signed up to reform in blood on the first day or are absolute fan tribute to Nigel Farage. There's just lots of things which they would like the Conservative Party to be able to say clearly and be able to look like they could act on in government. Once they start thinking Conservatives aren't going to get into government, if Nigel Farage says some of those things, maybe he's actually bringing in that sort of, still to the right of politics, but if you like, a different temperamental group of voters.
Right, we've pretty much bust our time limit. I'm going to give you one big thought to finish and see what you think of this. I'm just struck at the end of this pretty shocking day how unstable British politics is. Take the right, first of all. As we've just been talking about, you've now got two parties absolutely slugging it out on the right of British politics. Quite a lot of overlap. It is not clear who or what is going to win out there. And then in terms of Labour and the government, they have clearly signalled with today's reshuffle they are embarking on a new path. But exactly what that path is on all sorts of the reform agenda and whether they can afford it and whether or not the problem isn't actually the Treasury, which is the one bit that isn't touched, and just how stable it all is and whether changing everybody else other than Keir Starmer deals with the actual problem at the heart, well, none of that is yet clear. Maybe it will kind of become clearer in the days and weeks ahead. We just don't know. But there is that just sense of instability that we've had in politics really since about 2014, and it hasn't gone away.
For sure. And also remember, we do have a lot of people who have put all of their efforts, and they will think they did their very best, into the Keir Starmer project, who are now on the outside. Some of them will be quiet publicly, but I think that a lot of them may start to feel that they can start to have their say, and maybe they will raise the big question, which is this Keir Starmer's leadership question, as well as a series of unfortunate events?
That was an incredible day. Thank you very much indeed for listening to our special debrief edition. We will be back on Monday for Politics and Sam and Anne's. God knows where we'll be by then, but I can't wait. See you then, Anne.
Pranayama breathing until then, Sam. I think we all need a bit of it. Cheers. Have a great weekend, everyone.